Today's topic is cellular respiration, and this is a continuation of our study on how organisms get energy. It's connected to photosynthesis in that photosynthesis is the process that plants use to make glucose. Cellular respiration is the process that both plants and animals use to turn that glucose into ATP, which is the form of energy that their cells can use for their cell functions. So on the top of this paper, please write these 4 things. Cellular respiration. 2, that's how, just write the words food to energy. 3, write that means glucose being converted into ATP. And 4th, that both plants and animals have to do cellular respiration. So you look on the first picture on your handout. I'm going to ask you to write in the words where you see some empty blanks. Basically, what cellular respiration is the process of breaking glucose down to make ATP. And that happens 2 different ways, depending if we have enough oxygen for the cells to use. The first step is to take glucose and to break it in half in a process called glycolysis. So please write glycolysis in here and then put a big number 1 underneath it. In the presence of oxygen, so right up here with oxygen, the second process would be the Krebs cycle. The third process would be the electron transport system. And that is going to result in the cell making 36 molecules of ATP from each glucose that it started with. If oxygen is not present in sufficient amounts, your body can also make glucose another way. And that's called fermentation. And it means without oxygen. Fermentation then will yield us 2 molecules of ATP. So it's not as efficient, but sometimes it's necessary for the body to go that route. So when I'm doing exercise slow enough, like walking, and I have enough oxygen, I'm going to follow this pathway on the top. And if I'm doing something like sprinting for a long period of time, the energy production pathway will be down here. Next, just to introduce a couple of cell parts. So off on the side of your paper, make this tiny picture. Basically, a cell is the functional unit of a living thing. So draw just kind of a circle that represents the cell membrane. That's the edge of the cell. The cytoplasm is all the fluid that sort of fills up the cell. The nucleus is the control center in the middle. The organelle that we want to talk about today is the mitochondria. So you can see that they're just scattered around the cell. An organelle is just a word that refers to a smaller part of the cell that has a specific function. Next, we're going to talk about an overview of cellular respiration when you have enough oxygen present. The first thing to write in is glucose, because that is the molecule that we start with. And it's by breaking the glucose apart that we make ATP that the body can use for energy. Glycolysis is the first step, and it's going to occur in the cytoplasm. And we define that on the previous slide. We're going to look in depth at each of these steps along the way. But the idea to understand is that each step kind of makes a product that becomes the reactant of the step that follows it. So glycolysis is the process of breaking glucose basically in half to make pyruvic acid. That pyruvic acid then is the reactant for the Krebs cycle. So put a little number 2, because this is kind of step 2. The Krebs cycle produces a bunch of high energy molecules, and there are a few of those that are also produced in glycolysis. So these high energy molecules then become the reactant for the electron transport chain, which is really step 3 in this process. These last two steps, 2 and 3, happen in the mitochondria. And as we learned on the previous slide, that's an organelle in the cell. We often refer to it as the mighty mitochondria because it's the powerhouse or the energy producer of the cell. Kind of like a big old factory that produces electricity. The first step in this process is glycolysis. So right up here on the top of your slide, that this is basically breaking the glucose in half. To do that, the cell takes its glucose molecule and it has to invest a little bit of energy. So it adds these 2 ATP to start the change in this molecule. When we're finally done with glycolysis, we end up with pyruvic acid. So please write that on your sheet. So basically we started with glucose, which had 6 carbons in it. So this is just one glucose molecule. And we busted it in 2. And each of our pyruvic molecules has 3 carbons. So we haven't gained or lost any carbons. Again, we've just broken the molecule in half. Our cell here has gained 2 ATP molecules. We get 4 out of this, but it took us 2 to start. So that gives us a net gain of 2 ATPs. This process is running in the cell thousands and thousands of times per second. Again, the process of glycolysis. And this step does not require oxygen. So if you're sprinting and sprinting and sprinting, your body can still do glycolysis because it doesn't need to add or use oxygen to make this reaction work. The last product of this is a few high energy molecules, and they're going to go to step 3 in this process, which is the electron transport chain. Without enough oxygen present, the cell has to continue this process of making ATP through fermentation. Now what you see in the first part of this is what we had before. This was sort of the process of glycolysis. Pretend that's an L, okay? So that's kind of through this step here. The second part of this is sort of the fermentation part. Basically what happens in glycolysis is, again, we use those 2 ATP, we get 2 ATP out of it, but to make this work we have to have 2 low energy molecules, and that turns them into 2 high energy molecules. This process will happen until the cell runs out of these low energy molecules. And to sort of recycle them or regenerate more, the second half of this reaction happens, where the pyruvic acid gets changed into lactic acid. It turns 2 of these high energy molecules back into low energy molecules so that the cell can continue doing glycolysis. So again, we've talked about low energy molecules, high energy molecules, use that energy over here to produce the lactic acid, which again turns these into low energy molecules to be recycled. The downside of this for the cell is the production of lactic acid. Lactic acid is the chemical that builds up in your muscles that causes them to burn if you do a lot of anaerobic, without oxygen, exercise. So if I'm going to have you sprint 2 laps around the track, the first half lap your body probably has enough oxygen. As you finish the first lap, you're starting to, your cells are falling behind. So your body cannot provide as much oxygen as they need, and so your body starts doing lactic acid fermentation. As you get around the second lap of the track, your legs start to burn. The reason that your muscles burn is this is acid. That means it's low on the pH scale, and as it builds up in your cells, it drops the pH within the cell. The pain receptors then detect that, and it's irritating to them, that change in pH, and they fire a message off to your brain to say, ouch, 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 this hurts. And then usually that either causes you to stop exercising or to be mentally tough and finish. Anyway, so it's lactic acid buildup that causes your muscles to hurt. This is the end of the first lecture. The second lecture part will start with the next slide.